Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 1st of June 2015, Rod Bilton discussed what eating healthily really means.
Okay, good evening ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank Lorraine for inviting me to come and talk to Café Scientifique. It's also very nice to have a couple of friends here from my student days up at King's College when it was part of University of Durham. Well, I say they're my friends at this stage. I hope that'll be the case after this lecture, after the discussion. Now, I'm not allowed to have any visual aids, except my face, I think. Now, I don't know, I can't really do a lot with that, but what I have done is I've borrowed the traffic light scenario from industry, you know, to tell you what to eat, and I've made a list here, and I think that this could change your lives, this list, if you take notice of it, because that's why I've written this book. This book is to teach people how to behave themselves and how to improve the quality of life. And this is the only thing I've got to hand round. So if Lorraine's son can pop round and pass it round so you don't have to keep getting up. I'll start off at this side and see whether you can make head or tail of a list of dietary fat with things you should consign to the dustbin or light the fire with, things that are okay and things that are very good for you, which you might probably think are very bad for you. But things are changing, you know, and hopefully there's a scientific basis for what I'm going to say. Okay, so what's the problem, really, with this obesity crisis in the developed countries? Well, I'm afraid it's all in your genes, and it's all due to climate change. This isn't just the first bout of climate change that we're having now. Didn't tell you in the newspapers. It's been happening with great regularity over the last few million years. And our pre-human ancestors have been responding to these changes in the climate. Now, human evolution is a strange thing. It's counterintuitive in a way. For example, what about vitamin C? You know, vitamin C is an essential vitamin, isn't it? All those sailors died of scurvy around the times of Captain Cook. And don't you believe about limes? That's all propaganda. They had barrels of sauerkraut in the ships. They'd learned from the Dutch that sauerkraut stopped you getting scurvy, because the Dutch sailors didn't die in the thousands, but the British sailors did, because they ate sauerkraut, which was rich in vitamin C. Now, they had to eat it because they'd lost the gene for making vitamin C. But that happened about, shall we say, 40 million years ago, perhaps, in the Eocene. Our pre-human ancestors, quite a long way back, never mind 100,000 years, 40 million. They lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C. How could that be an advantage? Then a bit later, like another 15 million years later, there was another ice age, and this was a particular bad one which wiped out most of the pre-human ancestors. And the ones that survived through also lost the ability to break down uric acid, which is a normal metabolite when you eat meat and things with yeast in, breakdown of DNA and RNA. Uric acid is a toxic material. And it's got to be excreted. Now, animals break it down. There's an enzyme called uricase. We lost that as well. You think, well, two crucial enzymes have been lost. How on earth could that be a selective advantage? Well, it was all to do with getting fat. Because all the things that are bad for us now were good for us then. And that was because most of us were starving to death. And we've evolved to withstand extreme starvation and cold. Okay? We've still got those genes now. If we were to be put in such a situation, you know, we'd have a good crack at surviving. Okay, so that's the sort of genetic basis for it. The very things that are bad for us now, like sugar, fructose, high calories and starch, were in such short supply for our ancestors that they developed the genetic predisposition to hunt for these things. That's why we've got a sweet tooth. That's why sugar has the same effect as cocaine on your brain. It's addictive because your ancestors spent a lot of time looking for it because it kept them alive. So what do we do now? That's the question. That's what I want to go through. But just to briefly mention something with respect to the need for eating carbohydrate. True Eskimos, there are not many of them left now, most of them are on Coca-Cola and hamburgers and donuts now, but true Eskimos had a very, very low level of carbohydrate in the diet. They ate 80% fat, 15% protein, maybe 5% carbohydrate. They lived on the sea ice, they did fantastic endurance work, and they were relatively free from diseases such as heart disease and cancer, because quite detailed studies have been carried out on Inuit populations. So from that you could say that perhaps you don't need to eat carbohydrates at all. Yet 90% of the world's population eat a diet where the predominant calories are from carbohydrate. So we've got a lot of strange things that we need to consider here. Also, you all know, I'm sure, that everybody says glucose is absolutely essential for the brain. 3 minutes without glucose and there's irreversible brain damage. But of course that's carried out, you know, all this work has been related to people on mixed diets with carbohydrate. Nobody's ever done anything. Well, you can't do experiments like that, can you? You know, unless it's self-experimentation. You can't look at reducing the amount of glucose to human brains. You can with rats, and you find that starving rats can survive for longer with less brain damage than rats that are fed a mixed diet. So the question, how much of that do you believe with respect to transfer of that to the human condition? Now, let's just think a bit about the human digestive system, just quickly. Okay, you've got a stomach, you've got a small intestine, a long, thin, small intestine, in which most of the easily digestible foods are absorbed. Okay, so if you're on a mixed, high fibre diet, all the soluble stuff, the proteins, the lipids and carbohydrates, will be rapidly hydrolyzed and absorbed. The fibrous material is left and passes into the colon. Now in the colon, then the bacteria there can digest and hydrolyze the fibre, obviously to grow themselves, but also to produce short-chain fatty acids, and these feed the colonic epithelium, and they tend to protect against colon cancer and also against obesity. Okay, so this is one of the first things I want to talk about, the fact that processed food diets, where all the fiber's been removed, are going to be rapidly digested. They're leaving nothing very much for the organisms further down. So, you know, what's the outcome of that going to be? And it's very often bowel inflammation as a result of the lack of fiber and then inappropriate organisms growing in the gut. The things called gram-positive and gram-negative organisms. Most of the pathogenic organisms are gram-negative, like E. coli, salmonella, and things like that. Campylobacter, all these things that cause the problems, they get in when the healthy organisms, the gram-positives, I don't know if you've heard of bifidobacteria, they're very common in the feces of breastfed babies, and they offer fantastic protection against not only the infection by bacteria, but also by protozoa and viruses. And if I've got time at the end, I'd like to tell you about some very exciting research that's going on at the moment, which may replace the next generation of antibiotics in therapeutics. Now then, what about dietary myths? well, they're still going, they're still in the newspapers, they're still in all the magazines all the time, that fat is bad for you. And saturated fat is particularly bad for you. You still pick up a newspaper now or a magazine and you'll find that. Hundreds and hundreds of studies have proved this wrong. And grandma would say, you know, beef dripping, toast and beef dripping never did me any harm. Well, it didn't. She'd survived, hadn't she? And I would strongly suggest that if you've got the option to get any beef dripping anywhere, you would get it, because it's a perfectly healthy source of calories. But of course, if you're sitting using the computer or watching television for extended periods of time, then it won't do you a great deal of good. So of course I haven't really time to talk about exercise now. Suffice it to say that an hour of vigorous exercise a day is really what you need to just maintain a reasonable state of health. If you can do more, so much the better. It's like the Eskimos, 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day. But of course they were pulling sledges and stuff like that. If you eat 5,000 or 6,000 calorie days and copy the Inuit diet, well, I don't quite know what had happened to you, but saturated fat has effectively been replaced by polyunsaturated fat. Now, I haven't got time again to go into the politics, but there was some very bad research done in the middle 1900s in America, feeding rabbits with cholesterol and animal fat, and the rabbits got heart disease. Surprise, surprise. I don't think rabbits eat cholesterol or animal fat. That was publicised, and that changed the whole of American government policy. I don't know if anyone's heard of the McGovern reports in the 1970s. Said you've got to stop eating saturated fat, eggs, all sorts of stuff like that, and you've got to start eating polyunsaturated fat. Now, there's a political agenda there as well from the food companies, because the soya agribusiness was developing, and of course there was corn with corn oil to sell. And the point I want to make to you is that, is that paper going round? I've made a list of the polyunsaturated fats there, and you'll find that most of the commonly used vegetable oils that we have today are very rich in a fat called omega-6, linoleic acid. Now, there's been hundreds and hundreds of studies done showing that excessive amounts of this acid, which is essential in milligram amounts for your immune system to work. But if you eat it in gram amounts, remember there's 1,000 milligrams in a gram. And some people say that we're eating 1,000 times more of omega-6 nowadays than our ancestors did 100 years ago. And it's thought that the incidence, people say, oh, it's not true, you know, there was lots of heart disease in the olden days. I don't know whether there was, but we can certainly see inflections in the figures from the 1980s onwards, where there's a big increase in the uptake of these fats, in the uptake of fructose corn syrup you've all heard of. For goodness sake, keep away from that. It's lethal. Yet fructose was the original thing that kept human beings alive. When they ate fructose-rich fruit in the autumn before they got fat, so they could starve over the winter and survive. So you see, we're getting switches from one side to the other. And the other thing I want to mention is low-fat diets. I don't know how many people here are on low-fat diet at all. I hope not, because it's the last thing you should be on. Because what does industry do with low-fat diets? With low-fat yogurt? Read the label. If you can see the tiny print on it, you know, I need my specs. You'll find that it's got added starch and added sugar. And it's sugar that pushes up your blood lipid and also pushes up your cholesterol. But that's what I want to talk about in a minute, cholesterol. Everyone's frightened to death of cholesterol. Cholesterol's good for you. Cholesterol is essential for health. If you want to keep your brain in good shape, do not take the doctor's advice to get your cholesterol levels down below 4. Because if you do that, you're at a danger of age-related dementia, the risk of that increasing. Because you need the cholesterol to keep your nerve fibres in good shape. and the neurotransmission working. Your cholesterol goes right down, you could be in really bad shape. And this comes not from statin studies, but from studies of populations where there's low levels of cholesterol, like in Japan. There's increased incidence of dementia and also intracranial hemorrhage because it weakens the walls of the arteries and capillaries as well. So a lot of things here need to be thought about. It's not cholesterol that does you in, it's the inflammation. So what you've got to try and do is look for the source of inflammation. Okay? A lot of people are taking statins because they think they have to get the cholesterol down. That's not the way to reduce your risk of heart disease. The way is to decrease inflammation. Now, statins do that a little bit, okay? But it would be far better to modify your lifestyle, your diet, and particularly leave out all the vegetable cooking oils that you'll find in my red list over there. And it could be that if you leave them out and go back to eating saturated fat, as long as you don't overeat, then you might find that this inflammatory response goes down and you might not need to eat the statins anymore. Eat them, take them, whatever. You know, I mean, I've had friends, several friends, who've got diabetes and they've had heart attacks and they've been on statins, and I've said to them, do you take coenzyme Q? If you've heard of that, that's an essential vitamin that's involved in respiration, aerobic respiration. Statins knock that out, and that makes people's muscles, aerobic muscle, not work properly. So your body, without you knowing, switches from the aerobic muscle to the anaerobic muscle. So muscles that you use for lifting sacks of coal and pushing cars and climbing up mountains are now being used for lifting cups of tea. And they're not as efficient as aerobic muscle. So you get lactic acid produced. What does lactic acid do in your muscles? It causes fatigue. So even getting out of bed in the morning might well cause you fatigue. You know, we don't want that. We want to be keeping on doing exercise, particularly as we get older. So these are the kind of things to consider. Now, I'd like to finish. How am I doing for time? Just a few minutes. I'd like to jump and talk about something else, actually, that you've heard about probiotics all the time. You know, there's a lot of rubbish talked about probiotics and there's a lot of rubbish products. But if you can find the right product and you can eat the right diet, you might be able to transform your health as well as stopping eating all that junk fat, polyunsaturated fat. I should mention before I forget about fish oils. I'm definitely a proponent of fish oil because omega-3 fat in fish oil counteracts the inflammatory effects of omega-6 that occurs in this vegetable oil. But you've got to eat quite an excess, and nobody really does. The Eskimos would eat 20 grams a day of omega-3, and that would counteract the effects of the omega-6. We don't do that. We might take a gram per day. So all I can say to you is if you're not going to eat any more fish oil, you've got to eat less omega-6 in order to cut down on the inflammatory effects. Okay? Now, probiotics, together with adequate fibre in the diet, can transform your health by repopulating your lower gut with the proper organisms. And I want to finally say something which doesn't refer to people here, but to do with feeding newborn babies. Human milk contains unique oligosaccharides, short sugar molecules, which interfere with the binding of pathogenic organisms to the infant gut. You've got all these polysaccharide chains on the human cells waving about in the gut. You've got the disease organisms usually dock onto these polysaccharides and then attack them, and you get the infant diarrhea and stuff like that. Also viruses and protozoa dock onto these polysaccharides embedded in the membrane. Now, I can't understand why it's unique to humans, but I think it is. These small molecules, small sugar polymers, maybe 4 sugars joined together, actually have the same sequence as the ends of these long chains that the bacteria stick onto and the viruses stick onto. So the bacteria doesn't differentiate between the two, it sticks onto the soluble one, and that stops it binding to the gut wall of the infant. And then it's lost in the faeces. It's not killed, but that doesn't matter, it's gone. And it can't exert its infectious properties. And I think in the future, I hope there's going to be research into this area for adults as well, to make some of these molecules so that they can be used as probiotics, together with the appropriate fibres, things like porridge oats and Jerusalem artichokes, and that have got inulin in them. It's not digested by the host enzymes, it's only digested by the bugs in the colon, so that's fine. It used to be a popular crop before the potato arrived, and everybody relied on the organisms in the colon to digest it and get the calories from that. So there's a lot of things we can learn from history, as well as the results from the latest science. But this stuff on human milk oligosaccharides, I think, is the most exciting stuff I've read recently, because that might be the way forward, because not only does it protect against bacteria, but viruses and protozoa as well, whereas antibiotics are incredibly specific, you know, and the organisms gain resistance very, very quickly to them. And I think I'd better pause there, hadn't I? I've overshot. Right.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.